All right, there we go. Thank you guys for coming. Our first afternoon press conference. This is What Controlled the Rise of Oxygen on Earth? And so our panelists today are Joshua Krissansen-Totton from the University of Washington, Benjamin Mills from the University of Leeds, and Noah Planavsky from Yale University.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming interest. So my goal or my job here is to introduce a little bit of the concept, and then I'll turn it over to Ben that will talk about some of the exciting work that's coming out or that just came out at the start of this press release. So the general interest in the rise of atmospheric oxygen or Earth's oxygenation is driven by the fact that it's maybe the foremost example of how life. One of the foremost examples of how life has actually transformed our planet. With that idea, it's not surprising there's been a really long history of people trying to reconstruct how Earth's atmospheric oxygen levels have changed. And estimates historically are all over the place, right? This, I think, is illustrated in a figure that represents kind of a historical to contemporary view still. And you can tell it looks more like a bowl of spaghetti than anything that's a coherent message of how a key component of our atmosphere has changed through time. So there are estimates of oxygen being high throughout Earth's history to things that are stepped or progressive rises of atmospheric oxygen. So one of the key advances that come in the past decade is that we've moved away from a lot of these models. A lot of these models from both very simple geologic observations and geochemical observations have ruled out many of these options. So right now we're moving into a scenario where through most of Earth's history we're in a dramatically different Earth state than we are today. For most of Earth's history, atmospheric oxygen levels were markedly lower than they are today. Illustrated maybe foremost with rocks where you have ferrous iron, you have anoxic conditions in very shallow water settings, like this beautiful example from the Buwabik Iron Formation up by in Minnesota near where I grew up, which is totally irrelevant to anything other than it's a beautiful rock. So the emerging view now is that we have this multiple step or this protracted rise of atmospheric oxygen. That is supported by both sort of geologic observations, like I showed you, and again, a suite of geochemical proxies. The real question that is behind this, and what we'll get into for most of this, is what actually causes that? We've moved now into a state where we know what Earth actually did. The exciting question is not what was Earth's state, but what actually drove that? And that's going to be essential. Thinking about this mechanistically is going to be essential to try to understand how terrestrial planets work more generally, and that's an essential part of trying to explore planets outside of our solar system, which Josh and both Ben will briefly allude to as well. So one of the things also ending up here in empirical observations that sets the stage for this is we know that Earth's atmospheric oxygen levels are strongly tied to what the biosphere is doing, or to the scope of the biosphere. And what controls the scope or the amount of life on our planet are nutrients, right? Similar to when we think about this in an agricultural sense. You want to get more crops, assuming that you're not water limited, you have to add more nutrients. It's the same when you think about it from an Earth scale. And interestingly, we look at records of what is the main nutrient, phosphorus, limiting life on Earth. There's evidence for significant shifts in phosphorus records through its history. So we have empirical hints that this is related, this shift in nutrients, this shift in Earth's oxygenation are linked, but actually putting that in a mechanistic model is what we've been, up until arguably 1:30 today, have been lacking. So what Ben, I'll turn it over to Ben, will bring us into the point of how we can have a model, a self-consistent model for Earth's oxygenation that links nutrient cycling under anoxic conditions to regulatory feedbacks that control the amount of organic matter that's buried that control atmospheric oxygen levels.
Hi, thanks very much, Noah. That was a great introduction. Yeah, I'm Ben, and as a modeler, somebody who is very much interested in the how and the why of things. So it sort of questions, how did Earth's atmosphere become oxygen-rich, and how likely is this to happen on other small terrestrial planets? So as Noah's been saying, we've got a lot of, the data has been improving fantastically over the last couple of decades. We now have a pretty good idea of how the Earth became oxygenated. So just to kind of take you through this, assuming that this is a laser, it is. We have an events-based idea about oxygen on the Earth. I think that's the first thing to say. So this is the oxygen in the atmosphere. We have something called the Great Oxidation Event, which is where we think oxygen rose by many orders of magnitude and became a major constituent of the atmosphere. So this was in the start of the Proterozoic eon, 2.4 or so billion years ago. Then we have a period of potential stasis before another oxygenation event at the end of the Proterozoic eon, so about 800 million years ago or so. Perhaps another rise in atmospheric O2, but the beginning of the sort of oxygenation of the deep ocean. But this is kind of an unstable oxygenation. So you see, have an anoxic deep ocean, but then we start to get evidence for periods of oxygenation. Maybe it comes and goes. Maybe some places are oxygenated and some aren't. But this sort of thing continues right up until the mid-Paleozoic. So the POE, Paleozoic oxygenation event, something like 400 million years ago, is when you move up oxygen to stable levels. So you have a sort of resiliently oxygenated ocean. So what we have is a very events-based understanding of how oxygen works. You have this event, you have the second event, you have the third event, and each of these is a rise in oxygen, and it causes new parts of the Earth system to become oxygenated. But this poses an interesting problem for those of us who want to think about why this has happened. How has the Earth become oxygenated? Because photosynthesis, which still produces all of the oxygen on Earth one way or another, has existed for around 3 billion years. So throughout this whole time period where you've had these events, we've had photosynthesis. So this is a picture of some stromatolites, which are sedimentary structures made by microbial mats. These are sort of a modern relative of what we might have had 3 billion years ago. So we've had photosynthesis the whole time. We've had production of oxygen. Why has it risen in this step-like manner? And throughout the last few decades, as we've learned more about oxygen, people have started to come up with ideas about what has driven these changes. So maybe there are big shifts in tectonics. Maybe a lot of volcanism happened around the Great Oxidation. Maybe a breakup of a supercontinent happened around the Neoproterozoic. Maybe it's the uplift of mountains that causes sort of weathering and nutrients to go into the oceans. So you have all these ideas about specific events that might have caused these rises in oxygen. And similarly, if you looked at biological revolutions, you can make a similar story. Evolution of progressively more complex modes of life may have led to increases in oxygen concentration. So two big ones here are the evolution of eukaryote cells, so cells that have a nucleus, larger multicellular organisms that sink faster and therefore are better at sort of doing photosynthesis and locking away that material, or the evolution of land plants that obviously bury a lot of carbon now on the land. So you have a lot of ideas about things that can cause these stepwise oxygenation events, but there's no clear consensus. And this is where us in the kind of modeling and dynamics community have been for a while. We have lots of possible ideas about what's caused these events, but we don't have a consistent view, and we don't even know if they're really necessary. So what we've done in this new work, in this paper out today, is we kind of stripped everything back to the most simple things that we need to include in a model. A very simplified model of the ocean, of the atmosphere, of the deeper ocean, and of the feedbacks between the oxygen, carbon, and phosphorus cycles. And this includes one critical piece of information, or our conclusions from this, are that we don't require these events. And this is because we include Earth's nutrient cycles, which are not usually included in these kind of models. So I'm going to go on to explain that, but our major conclusion is that when you have a nutrient cycle-enabled model, you don't need these large events in order to drive oxygenation. And this is hinted at by the picture here, which is eutrophication. So this is when you pour a lot of nutrients, a lot of phosphate, into the marine environment, you actually consume oxygen. So even though phosphate drives photosynthesis that produces oxygen, it also drives respiration, remineralization in the water column, which consumes all of that oxygen. So you have two different things in play. So our simple model incorporates both of these things, so I'm not going to take you through it in too much exhaustive detail. The key things are that we have respiration and consumption of O2 in the surface waters, and we have feedbacks between phosphorus sedimentation and sort of regeneration from the sediments in the deeper ocean. Now, these two things are very important because if you were to pour phosphorus into this system, on the first hand, you have increased respiration, increased consumption of O2. So this drives eutrophication, marine anoxia. This sort of thing is happening at the present day. If you dump a lot of phosphorus into the marine environment, you consume the oxygen. This, of course, drives the water column anoxic. Now, if you have an anoxic water column, you then start to regenerate phosphorus from the sediments, and this can then fuel further productivity and further anoxia. So this is kind of a positive feedback cycle, and that if you put phosphorus into a system, you drive it anoxic, you regenerate more phosphorus, and you keep that anoxia going. Now, this is the sort of thing that people think happened millions of years ago in what are called ocean anoxic events. But we're going to treat it in a very different way here and think about what happens when you start anoxic and start to gradually oxygenate the system. So we took this very simplified model, and we set up a suite of runs where we vary how much reductant we're throwing into the system. So on an ancient planet with a very hot mantle, we expect more reduced gases to come into the system. And as that mantle's cooled over time, we expect that input of reductant to have decreased. That's one way that gradual oxygenation of the planet might have been achieved. But what we wanted to do is to see if we put that into this model, would oxygen go up in steps, or would it just go slowly up? And you can see what we get is these stepwise increases. So this is sort of represents an old planet, lots of reductant coming in. This represents a young planet, much less. And as you move from one to the other, you get an oxygen increase in the atmosphere, stepwise increases in the different areas of the continental shelves, because this is when those nutrient cycle feedbacks kick in, rapidly oxygenate. And even more intriguingly, we have these broken lines. So this is where there's no steady state in the model. And if we zoom into those areas and have a look, we see there's an oscillating solution. And this is because you're sitting between a strong positive feedback that's trying to oxygenate the system and a strong negative feedback, which is the overall export of carbon from that system. And you end up with an oscillating solution, which actually looks very similar to what we see when we start to look at that Neoproterozoic era, when the sort of shelf environments began to become oxygenated. So a gradual oxygenation of the Earth is expressed as distinct steps. With system instability, which is very similar to what we see in the record. And you can, of course, take our model and just apply a standard mantle cooling curve over time. So that's the only thing you need to put into this, just there's less reductant coming into the system over time. Obviously, you have photosynthesis, but we don't have any evolution of different kinds of life. We don't have any of these large tectonic events. And what comes out of the model is a step change in atmospheric O2, period of instability about 1 billion years later, and then resilient oxygenation of the system a few 100 million years after that. And that's very similar to what we see in the record. So our conclusions in this work are that these large tectonic or biological events that have been proposed to drive these oxygenation steps, they may not be required. They certainly aren't required in this framework. So that includes the idea that complex life may not be required to build a high O2 world. If we just had simple photosynthetic bacteria, the kind that have been around for 3 billion years, we leave that planet for 3 billion years, it's possible that it could have reached modern levels of oxygenation just like that. So with that, I'll leave it over to Josh.
All right, great, thanks. So I am based in an astronomy department, and so my primary interest in this subject is, we have these very large telescopes where we're soon going to be looking for signs of life, looking for oxygen elsewhere, and so the story of how Earth accumulated oxygen in its atmosphere could affect how we do that search, depending on what the answer is. Right? And so as you've already heard, we have this very good descriptive history of Earth's atmosphere through time, where there are seemingly these events where oxygen is increased. And so the natural human tendency, when you're kind of looking at this figure, is to say, well, there must have been something occurring at that time to cause those increases. And so, and Ben mentioned, different possibilities that have been discussed for that. If that's true, that's potentially bad news for the search for life elsewhere, right? Because that means you need to string together some sequence of tectonic events, biological events, to get to the modern levels of oxygen in the air, which are kind of the most readily detectable compared to previous times when you're thinking about telescope observations. And so, in my mind, what is most exciting about this paper is that it does away with the need for those events. So they just impose this gradual oxidation of the surface, which is done by a decline in the amount of volcanic gases that are coming out that like to consume oxygen, things like hydrogen and CO. And with that input, they can then reproduce the history of oxygen on Earth, as Ben alluded to. Reassuringly, this is consistent with some previous modeling work that have done a somewhat similar thing, where they've gradually reduced the amount of oxygen consumption from other gases, and you see the same sudden transition from low oxygen. You hit a tipping point and it jumps up. But what makes this study unique, I think, is it's the first time that the entire history of oxygen on Earth has been reproduced in a convincing way, without the need for special events along the way. This, of course, still leaves the interesting question: what is driving this gradual surface oxidation? Right? So in this paper, they try out a few possibilities, including this decline in volcanic gases. There are a number of ideas that are out there. One possibility is you're escaping a lot of hydrogen to space. So if you imagine a water molecule floating up in the atmosphere, you break it up with UV, the hydrogen is lost, the oxygen's left behind. That's a net oxidation of the planet that can have all sorts of downstream effects that can contribute to this gradual oxidation that you need. You might also do interesting things with the chemistry of the mantle. There are some recent measurements that show that the chemistry of the mantle seems to be moving in a direction that sort of favors less oxygen-consuming volcanic gases, right? Because the chemistry of the mantle controls what comes out of volcanoes, and so there's some evidence that is also contributing to this gradual oxidation. And then, of course, the other way you can do it, rather than a decline in the sinks of oxygen, you could also have a gradual increase in the sources of oxygen through burying carbon. And I think this possibility is something that would be an interesting topic for future research. So in Ben's paper, they explore both these drivers. So on the left, the driver is the gradual decline in volcanic gases, and then on the right, there is the gradual increase in the oxygen source from burying organic carbon. And these two scenarios make very different predictions that could, in principle, be tested by things such as the carbon isotope record. So I think this could be an interesting thing to do. And then finally, I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but just to say something about phosphorus. So how phosphorus works in low oxygen and oxic oceans is really crucial to the feedbacks that work in this model, the internal dynamics that give rise to that step change in oxygen. And so in this paper, they assume that when you have anoxic oceans, you get more phosphorus released back into the ocean, higher phosphorus concentrations. There is some other work out there that suggests the opposite might be true, that when you release, when you have anoxic oceans, it's the lack of oxygen makes it very difficult to re-release that phosphorus. And so it makes a different prediction about phosphorus in the ocean through time. So I think this is also a really interesting subject for future study, to try and really pin down how phosphorus is working and how it interacts with other biogeochemical cycles. So yeah, I think with that, we're all happy to take questions.
All right, yes, now we'll open it up to questions from reporters in the room. Anyone have any questions? Yeah. Say your name and affiliation.
Howard Lee, freelance. So this question is for Benjamin and Noah, really. You talked about the reduction in reductance. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what specifically the reductant that's reducing is, that in form that we could recognize, and talk us a little bit through why that leads to steps. How steep are those steps? Because we're talking about 3 billion years. Are they 1 billion year steps? Are they 1,000 year steps? And really talk us through that whole, why the gradual release leads to steps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I can try that. So the reductants that are coming into the surface system, in the model, we just treat it as something that consumes oxygen. We treat it as hydrogen, which would react with oxygen to form water. In reality, there's a sort of cocktail of reduced gases, including sulfur species, carbon monoxide, and then of course there are reduced hydrothermal fluids as well, say things containing iron. So it's a combination of things, but in general it's believed that as the mantle has cooled over time, you have a smaller heat flux going from mantle to surface, and therefore less transport of all of these things in general into the surface system. So I hope that answers the first question of what is this stuff. Now, yeah, if you were to take the sort of models that we used to use, sort of models that I've developed over the last kind of 10 years or so, before we did this work, if you just put in that gradual smaller and smaller amounts of reductant coming into the system over time, you're just going to slowly build up O2. And that's not what happens in the geological record. The reason this model does it differently is due to those nutrient cycles. And this is because when you begin to oxygenate the water column, you shut off the recycling of phosphorus. And when you do that, you can't do as much productivity, so you don't use as much oxygen in the ocean interior. So it's kind of like an OAE, an ocean anoxic event in reverse. It's an ocean oxic event. So these are positive feedbacks which are relatively well characterized in terms of deoxygenating the ocean. So all you have to do is think about it backwards in terms of what if we start from an anoxic state and begin to oxygenate the ocean. So it's that shut off of the phosphorus supply that drives it. And then on the time scale is ultimately controlled by the atmospheric oxygen, the largest reservoir of oxygen on Earth, and how that responds. So within the ocean, the changes are much more rapid. They're on sort of 1,000-year scales. But to actually stabilize the system, it's about variation of the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, which is something that typically happens over sort of 1 million years or so. That sort of time frame.
But the steps are on, kind of, think of it as 2 or 3 broad steps through Earth's history. So billion-year scale steps. And I think the simplest way to think about reductant, also, you can just think of it as iron and sulfur phases that consume oxygen is the majority of the budget. Although it is tempting to think of it as a cocktail, of course.
All right, do we have other questions from reporters in the room? No, you can stay.
Hi, Dan, Vision Media. I'm also a high school biology teacher, so I've seen this graph, forever. This gradual, not the gradual, but the stepwise change. So what you're not positing that releases of phosphorus are leading to blooms of algae that produce more oxygen, but a eutrophication it's gonna be another sink for oxygen. So how is phosphorus then, how is that producing, I'm confused about the steps that you're creating out of a phosphorus flux.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a very good point. So I think the best way to visualize this is that the phosphorus-oxygen connection adds what's called a positive feedback into the system. So it can work in one way. If you pour in phosphorus, you deoxygenate, you get more phosphorus, you go around that cycle and you deoxygenate.
But that's a biologic.
Yep, yep, but you can do it in the other way as well. So it's all biologically related. It's about biogeochemical cycling. So if you accept that these exist within the system, that yes, because of the relationship between biology and nutrient availability and oxygen, if we start to oxygenate an ocean basin that is anoxic, we'll suddenly draw down a lot of phosphorus. We will limit the primary production. We will then limit the remineralization in the water column and further then oxygenate that water column. So that takes a sort of a line that would be smooth. And once you add positive feedbacks in there, you get a line that has steps in it. And that's kind of a simplification of what we see.
I'm sorry. Are you saying that the geologic input then is a flux of phosphorus that's going to stimulate the growth of organisms that are then going to die and use up, decomposition is going to use up the oxygen, and that's a step.
Yeah.
And then that will stabilize and oxygen will come back and then that will happen again, and that's a step.
Sort of. That's actually what's happening in those wiggly plots I showed when we have the area of instability. So yes, you can exactly have that sort of instability where you step between an oxygenated and an anoxic system. And that sort of thing can take 5 to 20 million years, which is the time it takes for the atmospheric oxygen reservoir to adjust. And that's also the sort of thing we see in the geological record. But the long-term steps are a combination between the existence of this positive feedback and sufficient other negative feedbacks that help stabilize the system. So while there is an area of instability, once you get past that, you're into stable oxygenation or stable deoxygenation. I hope that makes some sense.
Sorry, my only other question was how can we, how can this tell us about eutrophication today? Can that help us with anything today?
It can't tell us much about eutrophication today. It's very much based on the information we have from the present day telling us about what happened in the past. But throughout the geological record, there certainly seems to be a lot of evidence of when we have anoxic and especially high sulfide conditions that you drive a lot of this nutrient recycling. So it seems to be something that it's not just something that happens in short terms in the present day. It's something that we're pretty sure happened during the anoxic events during the Cretaceous and seems to be happening in reverse during these oxic events earlier on. So yeah, it seems to be a major feature of the Earth system.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Gramling with Science News Magazine. I was just curious, I understand what you're saying about not having to actually invoke these kinds of large events to make this happen, but given that some of those large events did happen, how might they be overprinted onto the model that you have here? How might they have actually changed that or not changed it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's a very good point. We're saying these events are not, well, I'm saying these events are not necessarily required, but a lot of them happened. So this may, one thing this may be is it may drive additional variability because, of course, our model produces these long-term steps, but I think the more geochemistry we do over time, the more we're going to find further variability here. So there's already emerging ideas that the great oxidation event was not necessarily a single event. The same with the oxygenation in the Neoproterozoic. There seems to be a lot of oscillations and a lot of more detail in these events than we see in the sort of cartoons that we like to draw. So I think secondary events certainly do a lot. And it certainly could still be true that the proximate triggers for these events could still be biological or abiotic changes. If you have a system that's becoming more oxygenated and is about to hit one of these points where it flips, if a large volcanic eruption happens, an igneous province is in place, or a new kind of biota evolves, then that could certainly tip the scales. So we're certainly not saying that these things didn't happen because we know that they did. However, it may have been a tendency to over-attribute things to these events. So things like large igneous provinces, for example, they have happened hundreds of times in the history of the Earth. So I think we have to think very carefully about how large these events are and when they may or may not have triggered other things.
I think you could also think of it as the better refining what is the forcing in the model provides a way to traditionally test that. If you can perfectly explain the timing of this with the best guess of an outgassing curve, there's no reason to think that even though you have a shift in the biological community, that changed your ability to bury organic carbon and release oxygen at all. So some of it is you can test that idea. That's not just a hypothetical question. You can test that by better refining what goes into the model, or by better, because there's debate on all of the things as well. People have invoked that eukaryotes or having the diversification of more complex life would change the oxygen cycle, but that's a view that many people would say is very poorly founded. So in some ways, I think even that seems abstracted. There are easy ways to make your question a very tractable question by refining, by continuing to move towards more consensus on what are the forcings of these model and the timing of these events.
Just to build on that, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but my impression of your model is not to say this is the way that it happened, but rather here is a general modeling framework with a variety of assumptions can reproduce the history of oxygen that we see. And so, you could certainly get into the details of those events and see how they add to the story and how well can you fit the model to what we know about the geologic evolution.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, just to summarize what we've all been saying, the key point of all of this is yes, these events could have happened, and yes, these events could have caused large changes in O2, but we didn't necessarily need them. And oxygenation of a planet in general, just because we see this stepwise sort of thing happening on Earth, doesn't mean we need massive events in order to drive oxygenation.
Do we have any other questions from reporters in the room? Yeah.
Howard Lee, freelance again. So following on from that last question, do you have any thoughts on the big snowball Earth events and because the previous paradigm was that there were changes in the biological carbon pump, and really it's two sides of the same coin here, and it's just a follow-on from that about the snowball Earth events.
Yeah, well, interestingly, so snowball Earth events, large global glaciations, seem to be associated with the first two steps, so the Great Oxidation event and the Neoproterozoic event. And you can see how that might be true if we have large changes in Earth's carbon cycle, and of course the atmospheric CO2 reservoir is linked to Earth's carbon cycle. There certainly might be some marrying up of these things. In the current model, we haven't included atmospheric CO2 in temperature, so this is certainly something to think about. So one possibility is that all of these sort of instabilities, these step shifts, might be something contributing to snowball Earth. The other possibility is that things that drive snowball Earth may initiate these kind of oxygen shifts. So that's definitely an avenue for further work. It's been notoriously difficult to include snowball Earth in these kinds of models, these sort of budgeting models, because we don't really have a good idea of how snowball Earth works.
If I can just quickly flick back to a slide. So some of the previous modeling work on the step change in oxygen addresses this, where this is a modeling of the first rise of oxygen. You get a collapse in atmospheric methane associated with that oxygen increase, which is potentially enough of a reduction in the greenhouse forcing to contribute to a snowball event.
Okay, so we actually have a question from the web chat, and this is from Rick Lovett, freelance, and he would like you to go over a little bit more clarification on the big 3 oxygenation steps and what exactly were those tipping points.
Okay, so you're talking about, you're asking about what drove those events in our model. What are the points that are doing that? Yeah, certainly, I can do that. I might actually point at the screen for that. So, as Josh has just pointed out, there's been a lot of previous work on the great oxidation. The first of these events, which is one that happens about 2.4 billion years ago. So this previous work shows that atmospheric feedbacks between methane, ozone shielding, and sort of photochemical reactions can drive this oxygenation of the atmosphere. So this is the first one of those events. So there's quite the body of work behind this. So certainly these references that Josh put up are all very useful information on that. So this first oxygenation event, which is purely in the atmosphere, has been fairly well studied. And it generally seems to be to do with the formation of an ozone layer, in that you have photochemical reactions between oxygen and methane, but when you begin to form an ozone layer, you sort of make those reactions a little more difficult to do, and you have a point where oxygen can rise here, as well as methane rising slightly, and change to a kind of different system where you can have more oxygen and less methane, because back in this system, you have quite a lot of methane and a lot less oxygen, so methane and oxygen are being destroyed together, they're reacting. So that's the first event, and what we really added to this was what happens in the oceans. So that atmospheric event in our model is very similar to in previous models. For us, it is just having the input of reductant into the system being suddenly less than the production rate of oxygen, at which point you flip to a higher state. These later oxygenation events are driven by the phosphorus feedback. So the one in the Neoproterozoic is as oxygen is slowly rising, so oxygen concentration is very slowly rising at this point. You can see it in the deep ocean. And you reach a point where you just start to begin to oxygenate the bottom waters. And when you oxygenate the bottom waters and the water-sediment interface, this is when you begin to trap phosphorus. So you get into this situation here where you begin to trap phosphorus, and when you do that, you clear out the water column because you haven't got as much productivity, you haven't got as much sort of rain down and remineralization of material. So you clear the water column and oxygenate it. But this is highly unstable at first. So this is why you have this unstable period. This dotted box represents that the solution is actually wiggling around in between these two things. So you start this unstable process because you oxygenate the seafloor, you trap the phosphorus, you oxygenate the water column, but then with this oxygenated water column and lower productivity, you're just not doing as much photosynthesis, you're not bearing as much carbon, so atmospheric O2 seems to come back down again. Then you have a rapid return to anoxia, and then it all flips back again. So this is the kind of thing that you might see in ocean anoxic events as well. So that's what drives this sort of unstable period. And then you come out of this unstable period just because as you slowly have less and less reductant coming into the system, you reach a point where you just get to that oxygenation. You do cut off your productivity, but not enough. Oxygen doesn't go back below that threshold at which the system then turns anoxic again. So if you imagine it's a system that really wants to oscillate, and you come in it from the bottom in an anoxic state, you start to hit those oscillations, but eventually as you keep putting in less and less reductant, you push through them and you reach a resiliently oxygenated system. And that seems to be very similar to what we see in the geochemical record. Now that's how it occurs in this model.
That's good. Okay, great. Do we have any more questions from the room? Okay. All right. Well, I think the speakers will be around for a few more minutes if anyone else wants to ask them anything. Thank you very much to our panel, and we'll resume again at 2:30. That's it.